So, I want to talk today about rules versus boundaries, because there is a difference, but really they can look the same, but the connotation is gonna it can be very different. Human nature is such that a lot of us, probably most of us, are not really very good at being told what to do. We kind of like having our autonomy respected and being able to make choices for ourselves. And so most of the time when there's a rule, our instinct is to find a way around it. Whereas a boundary is something that we choose for ourselves. So I want to kind of go into some differences, which are mainly maybe even semantic, but mostly just the kind of the connotation between the two. So rules are compulsory. Okay, I have to do this, or I can't do that, um, and so it kind of sets this hard line of compulsory behavior control. Whereas a boundary is voluntary. Like, I choose to do this, or I choose to not do this. For instance, let's say you make a rule for yourself that you can't eat cake for breakfast. Okay. So if you say, I can't eat cake for breakfast, chances are you're going to want to eat cake for breakfast. If the boundary is, I can eat cake for breakfast, I choose to not eat cake for breakfast, it has a very different feel about it. One is a rule that suddenly you're now looking to break, and the other is a boundary that you are exercising your autonomy to stay within. Okay, does that make sense? Hopefully that it makes sense what I'm saying there. Rules tend to be restrictive, whereas boundaries are focused on being protective. Okay, so if you have a boundary, think about a boundary as a fence around a yard, and you're trying to keep dogs or small children contained. Okay, that fence provides a protective boundary to keep them safe. So boundaries help to define the limits of where is safe and where is unsafe. And in context of food, it might be what serves me. The within those boundaries is what serves me, and outside those boundaries does not serve me, from an eating standpoint. We can You could probably think of some specifics for yourself within that context. Rules tend to be designed to control behavior, whereas boundaries tend to define principles. Okay, so rather than trying to control behavior, we're saying these are the principles that I want my behavior to be in line with. Um, and then obviously, I already went into like, rules are meant to control, boundaries. I'm just going down my list, and I got ahead of myself. Boundaries are meant to define limits. Rules demand compliance, whereas boundaries honor autonomy. Okay. And even if we're setting the rule for ourselves, it's just kind of that limit, or that connotation of a rule that we set for ourselves versus a boundary that we set for ourselves. And then rules have a tendency to have a specific application. For instance, um, no sugar, you can't eat sugar, or you are not allowed to eat past a certain time of day, or those kinds of things. There, there, there's a specific application there, and boundaries have a tendency to have a little bit more of a broad application. For example, eating when you're hungry versus you can't eat except for within these time periods, say in the case of intermittent fasting. Um, uh, you know, the rule no sugar can be balanced or countered by the boundary of, you know, you can eat sugar, but you want to keep it in moderation, and maybe you have some boundaries for that. Um, Now, the violation of rules and boundaries both come with some consequences. But the difference too, there's a difference there. And that is that the the consequences for violating a rule tend to be punitive. For instance, if I don't stick to my diet, then I have to starve myself tomorrow. If I overeat today, then I have to starve myself tomorrow because otherwise it will be in a calorie um, surplus, and then I won't lose the weight that I'm supposed to be losing. Okay, so you punish yourself, or you are punished by the rule setter, and also those consequences tend to be rooted in shame or failure, feeling like a failure, and that's just not healthy. That's just that's not productive. It's not motivating. It's not uplifting. It's not helpful. Okay, we never want to use, especially in the context of eating, we never want to use punitive consequences or shame or failure. So that's why I don't like food rules, because of that connotation. Now, boundaries, on the other hand, when you have created some boundaries for yourself and then you step outside those boundaries, you're accepting responsibility for the consequences, because you're making an educated and con, you're making a choice, right? You're making a deliberate decision to step outside those boundaries, and by doing that you are accepting the consequences that come with that. For example, if you have a boundary of eating only until you're at a 5 and you eat until you're an 8, the natural consequence of that is you're going to probably spend a couple hours feeling very physically uncomfortable with that overfilled stomach, and that's a consequence that you accepted responsibility for when you chose to eat past that boundary of 5. So the consequences are more naturally occurring. And by making that deliberate choice, you are accepting those consequences. So that's that's the differences that I see between rules and boundaries. And so I'm going to give you a challenge. I want you to come up with some food boundaries, maybe 2 or 3 of them, that are boundaries that you choose to set for yourself when it comes to eating. And it can be related to the when, the how much, or even the what. Just try to make sure that you're not crossing the line into rule territory. Okay, keep them true boundaries, using kind of that criteria, those differences that I explained, and choose those for yourselves and write them down. And because when we set boundaries for ourselves, then we have um, some definable limits, right? Because if we don't have any boundaries, then it's just a free for all, and then we end up, overeating, eating foods that don't make us feel good, and you know we end up kind of in the same place that we don't want to be in. So there needs to be some boundaries, but they also need to be reasonable. They need to be autonomy honoring. So as you're coming up with those boundaries, be really mindful about it to make sure that you're not crossing over into rule territory. And be very, very honest with yourself. What is the connotation that is being attached to this boundary, or to this, what I'm set, this guide that I'm setting here? Is it a rule? Is it a true boundary? And then share those with me. I would love to hear what you're coming up with. And those boundaries will help us to make decisions that help us to honor those boundaries, to stay within those boundaries. So if you have any questions or confusion about what I'm saying, be sure to ask. I love all the questions, and I want to make sure that we're being very clear.